Hey guys, tonight we're plunging straight into the medieval world. A place of howling winds, icy roads, and peasants shivering in cloaks so thin they might as well be spiderwebs. Snow drifts pile high against timber doors. Smoke coils from straw roofs into a sky like hammered iron. You trudge through frozen mud, breath clouding the air, and your teeth clack so hard you're convinced they'll chip. Everything feels brittle, sharp, and unfriendly. And guess what? You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first icy slap of winter comes earlier than you'd like. One morning, the ground is soft and squelchy under your leather soles. The next, it's glass hard and littered with rime frost like shattered diamonds. You feel it in your lungs first, air so cold it burns as it rushes down your windpipe, making every breath a tiny punishment. Your nose dribbles like a toddler's, and wiping it on your sleeve leaves crusty streaks that freeze into stiff ridges. People in the Middle Ages knew the calendar. Sure, but seasons didn't always arrive politely. One year, snow might hold off till December. Another year, October slams shut with an ice storm that snaps branches and sends roof tiles skittering across the village green. Historians still argue whether European winters during the so-called Little Ice Age were truly colder than before, or if people just wrote about the bad years because, well, nobody bothers chronicling a nice, mild February. One solid fact: medieval Europe was getting colder between the 1300s and 1500s. That's your mainstream historical reality check. Grain harvests shrank. Alpine glaciers advanced. The Thames in London sometimes froze solid enough for folks to roast meat on bonfires set directly on the ice, because apparently nothing says festive like grilling sausages on a river. But you don't have sausages. You're a peasant. Winter for you means your toes feel like they'll snap off whenever you go outside. The wind shrieks through the cracks in your wattle and daub hut, rattling wooden shutters like an angry poltergeist. You wrap your single wool cloak tighter around yourself and wonder whether you'll even have firewood by January. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some folks believe certain saints controlled the weather. If Saint Medard smiled on you, mild rains would keep crops alive. If he sulked, snow might bury the entire countryside. People even used rhyming proverbs to predict how long winter would last. Like, Saint Medard's rain lasts 40 days, which is the medieval equivalent of blaming your weather app for lying to you. The cold attacks your body in sneaky ways. Lips crack and bleed. Eyelashes freeze into brittle spikes. Joints ache so deeply you're sure you're growing barnacles on your bones. Sometimes the silence itself becomes eerie. Snow muffles footsteps. You can hear your own heart beating in your ears. It's so quiet that the creak of a distant cart will sound like thunder rolling through the clouds. And yet, some people claim to love this season. Not you. You know that frost's first bite isn't just uncomfortable. It's a herald. A grim warning that everything's about to become a test of endurance. Food dwindles. Animalsti. Neighbors become suspiciously protective of their cellars. You also start measuring your life in tasks you can complete before your fingers go numb. Need to chop wood? Good luck when the axe head keeps flying off the handle because the wood shrinks in the cold. Need to haul water? Prepare to shatter the ice with your iron pole first. Then heave bucket after bucket while your hands scream in protest. A popular medieval superstition was that harsh early frosts meant a merciless winter to come. Peasants whispered that the earth itself was angry, or that witches were stealing the warmth to power their unholy rituals. Historians still argue whether belief in witches spiked precisely because people needed someone to blame for lousy weather. A scapegoat always makes the snow feel slightly less personal. Remember, you're also worried about the animals. Chickens huddle together, feathers puffed like dusty pom-poms. The cow's milk yield drops, because even cows draw the line at producing breakfast in a frozen barn. Pigs might survive, but only if you've got enough slop, and you probably don't. And here's a delightful fringe tidbit. In some alpine regions, peasants believed you could scare away winter by banging pots and pans outside your door. The theory was that evil spirits hated noise. So, picture a shivering medieval village where half the population stands outside in ankle-deep snow, shrieking and whacking cookware together like an off-key percussion band. All because you're convinced frost demons are lurking in the dark. Be why the time December arrives. Your breath is fogging thicker than the soup in your pot. Snow dusts every thatched roof, creating a landscape so pretty it'd be Instagram famous, if you weren't too busy praying for your survival. Winter is no longer a possibility. It's here, and there's no turning it away, which means your next worry is food. You stomp your feet on the hard-packed dirt floor, half to keep warm, half to wake yourself up from the creeping exhaustion that hovers over winter days. Because as soon as frost bites, a new dread crawls into your bones: the dwindling of food. The first rule of medieval survival is simple. If you didn't store enough in the autumn, you're in trouble. Actually, scratch that. You're not just in trouble. You're auditioning for a starring role in medieval peasant Hunger Games. It all starts in your root cellar. You know the place. That damp, dark pit under your house where every step risks twisting your ankle on a loose rock or slipping on a patch of slimy mold. The air down there smells like earth and old onions, mixed with an aroma best described as potato funk. You light a tallow candle and peer into the gloom, counting turnips, beets, and carrots stacked in straw. Every shriveled vegetable is precious now, because in winter, each meal feels like a math problem. How many people can you feed on half a sack of barley without provoking a family mutiny? Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the Middle Ages, a peasant household might rely on a winter diet dominated by preserved foods, salted meat, dried legumes, stored grain, and root vegetables. Fresh food was basically off the menu unless you lived near a fishing port or your hens miraculously kept laying eggs. Which, let's be real, they probably didn't. But let's sprinkle in a fringe tidbit. Moldy bread wasn't always tossed out. People sometimes trimmed away the green bits and ate the rest, reasoning that bread's expensive and mold can't possibly be that dangerous. Historians still argue whether ergot poisoning, the nasty fungal toxin lurking in rye, caused medieval hallucinations, including visions of demons or witches, which, frankly, makes winter even scarier than the weather itself. The stress of food scarcity sours everyone's mood. Suddenly, your sweet grandmother starts side-eyeing your portions. Your dad eyes the family pig with a look suggesting he'd trade his own boots for a sizzling pork chop. And your little brother keeps sneaking into the cellar at night, only to emerge with suspicious turnip breath. One joke among peasants went like this: "Our Lord turned water into wine, but can he turn my 2 beets into a feast?"
Spoiler alert. No.
He could not. Not unless you were a saint or at least best friends with one. Imagine how each day unfolds. You wake hungry. You go to sleep hungrier. Your meals shrink to bowls of thin pottage, a sort of vegetable soup so watery that historians sometimes joke you could read a manuscript through it if you held the parchment under your spoon. Some winters, snow-blocked roads, meaning no grain shipments reached your village. If your harvest was poor the previous autumn, you'd be forced to ration. Half measures of flour, quarter scoops of oats. Eventually, you're scraping the flour bin for the flour dust itself, pressing it into sad little cakes that look and taste like medieval chalk. By February, peasants entered the notorious hungry gap. That's the span when stored supplies run out, but spring crops aren't ready yet. It's the medieval version of checking your fridge 10 times in an hour, hoping new food has magically appeared. And speaking of hope, there's a medieval belief that certain saints would guard your pantry if you prayed hard enough. Folks invoked Saint Nicholas not just for children's gifts, but also for preventing grain theft. Which is ironic, because Saint Nicholas probably couldn't keep your neighbor from borrowing a handful of barley under cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether peasant communities were more communal or cutthroat in times of scarcity. One scholar paints a rosy picture of neighbors helping neighbors, sharing beans and bread. Another insists that the moment hunger sets in, people hoard, hide, and guard their food with pitchforks. Maybe it depended on the village or on how many turnips were left. Winter hunger didn't just shrink bodies. It warped your brain. Chronic undernutrition blurred vision, slowed thoughts, and made you irritable. You start fixating on food. Dreams turn into elaborate culinary fantasies. One night you're gnawing on a piece of bark. The next, you dream of tables loaded with roast goose, cheese wheels, and buttery rolls, only to wake up to another bowl of pottage. A truly bleak reality? Many medieval peasants kept a tally on the cellar wall, scratching marks to count how many days' worth of grain remained. Watching those marks dwindle might be the medieval equivalent of watching your bank account tick closer to zero. But hey, here's a quirky detail to lighten the gloom. Sometimes peasants tried to stretch their supplies with bizarre ingredients. Tree bark, ground acorns, and even straw were mixed into bread dough to bulk it up. That's right, winter might force you into eating paleo bread with actual bits of tree. You'd chew for hours and still feel like you'd swallowed a basket. Of course, not everyone starved. The wealthier villagers might still have hams hanging from the rafters, wheels of hard cheese, or casks of ale tucked away. Nothing adds salt to your medieval wounds like hearing your neighbor throwing a feast while your stomach growls loud enough to echo off the beams. The longer winter drags on, the more desperate things get, and desperation leads to theft, barter, or begging. You might offer your best cloak for a loaf of bread, or sell your only cooking pot just to buy a handful of dried peas. And while your body withers, the cold never stops. Soon you're worrying about more than just what's in the cellar. You're worrying about whether your tools, the very ones you need to keep working, will even survive the chill. So there you are, bellies grumbling, turnip supply dwindling, and the cold refusing to take a day off. As if hunger weren't enough, winter finds a new way to mess with you. It comes for your tools, your gear, and, most painfully, your fingers. The moment December air sharpens its claws, everything you own seems to betray you. Iron tools? They get brittle and snap if you smack them too hard. Wooden handles? They splinter, warp, or shrink, leaving your axe head whizzing off into the snow like a lethal frisbee. Your plow, that noble beast of burden you rely on for spring planting, creaks ominously every time you try to move it. The wheels on your cart freeze solid. Leather straps stiffen into uncooperative sticks that could double as medieval rulers. Mainstream historical fact alert: medieval peasants' tools were often locally made and maintained. Blacksmiths crafted plowshares, axes, and knives. But in winter, even a skilled smith struggled because frigid temperatures made metal more brittle. Repairs took longer because fires burned lower, fuel was scarce, and no one wanted to hammer iron while frostbitten. Meanwhile, your hands, the medieval peasants' most valuable tools, become lumps of ice. Your fingertips crack, sometimes bleeding so freely it looks like you've been in a tavern brawl. And here's the lovely irony. To fix anything, you need fine motor skills, but your fingers are as coordinated as frozen sausages. A quirky tidbit for you. Some medieval folks believed carrying warm pebbles in their pockets helped keep fingers from freezing. Apparently, medieval fashion included pocket rocks. Move over AirPods, rocks were the true winter essential. Historians still argue whether technological advancements like the heavy plow truly alleviated peasant hardships in winter. One camp claims better iron tools changed everything. Another argues that no matter how fancy your plow, if the ground's frozen solid, you're just chiseling ice for no reason. Daily chores become Herculean trials. Drawing water requires smashing through a thick crust of ice in the well. Need to chop wood? Your axe bounces off frozen logs like it's hitting stone. Try washing clothes? Hilarious. Fabrics freeze stiff in the rinse water, turning your shirt into a medieval ice sculpture. Joke break. You know it's cold when your shirt stands up and folds itself. Medieval haute couture, courtesy of winter. Farm work grinds to a halt because animals huddle inside barns, refusing to budge. Even the pigs look offended when you try to drive them outside. The plow rusts under a thin crust of snow. Your scythe might as well be a fancy paperweight. It's not just tools. Buildings creak and complain under ice. Wattle and daub walls crack as moisture trapped in the weave freezes and expands, causing chunks to pop off like medieval drywall. You stuff straw in the gaps, but icy air whistles through anyway, carrying with it the faint scent of frozen dung, and the village's communal well, your precious water supply, becomes a daily ordeal. Peasants chip at ice with iron bars or axes, creating a jagged hole. But drop your bucket into the water and the rope might freeze solid before you haul it up. Suddenly, a bucket of water weighs about as much as a cow, and your fingers feel like they're gripping icicles instead of rope. Point one fringe detail. Some folks attempted ice fishing in village ponds when the well became too much hassle. Peasants chopped holes in the ice and dangled bits of bread or cheese on hooks. Apparently, medieval fish had the same snack preferences as modern toddlers. Even simple repairs become nightmarish. A broken cart axle in summer? No big deal. In winter, it's a crisis. You'd have to soak wood overnight to keep it from splintering, but water is scarce, and freezing your replacement parts into solid blocks of ice isn't helpful. Historians still argue whether peasants were genuinely ingenious problem solvers or simply stubborn enough to brute force repairs despite the odds. Maybe a bit of both. But one thing's certain. Each cracked tool and snapped harness becomes another threat to survival. Meanwhile, your body's starting to join the casualty list. Your nails split and peel. The skin on your knuckles resembles dried parchment. Any wound takes longer to heal because blood circulation slows in the cold. Plus, if you get even a tiny cut while chopping wood or fixing fences, it might fester into a festering medieval horror show. Joke break number 2. Medieval people would probably look at modern moisturizing lotion like it was unicorn tears. Hand cream? A winter miracle. Remember your plow? Even if you miraculously keep it intact, you can't push it through iron-hard earth. So the fields lie fallow under drifts of snow, and every farmer spends winter pacing like a caged bear, waiting for the thaw. Meanwhile, the sound of tools breaking rings through the village like funeral bells. Someone's hammer snaps. Someone else loses a wagon wheel. And above it all, the wind howls through bare branches, reminding you that even the trees are suffering. Another quirky tidbit. In some regions, peasants believed that creaking trees talked in winter, carrying messages from spirits or omens of death. So, when your rafters groan at midnight, you're left wondering if it's the timber or something supernatural coming to collect. And that's the most medieval thing of all. The way practical fears, like a broken plow, intertwine with superstition. In winter, you don't just fear the cold. You fear what might be lurking inside it. Which brings us to your next winter torment. How to keep yourself warm when your fire decides it hates you. Let's talk fire. You'd think it'd be your trusty ally in winter, right? But in medieval life, even your hearth has a mean streak. Fires that flickering promise in the darkness. A fragile glow that's supposed to keep frostbite at bay and your toes attached to your body. Except, your fire constantly lets you down. It's a friend who shows up late, leaves early, and eats all your bread while complaining about the draft. Picture it. You stumble out of bed in the dawn gloom, breath misting like dragon smoke. Your first priority? Rekindle last night's embers. You kneel over a heap of ash, poking desperately for the faintest red glow. If it's gone completely cold, you're out of luck and out of matches because those don't exist yet. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval people started fires with flint and steel, striking sparks into dry tinder like straw, bark, or scraps of linen soaked in animal fat. And while that's a neat wilderness survival skill, it's significantly less charming when you've got frost crusting your eyebrows and your fingers refuse to bend. You blow gently. Sparks hiss and die. You blow harder and inhale a lungful of soot, coughing so violently that your neighbors wonder if you've contracted the plague. Speaking of plague, historians still argue whether harsh winters actually suppress disease by killing off fleas and rats, or whether everyone just huddled closer indoors, helping infections spread. So basically, Either the cold saves you or seals your doom. Nice. Even if you coax a flame to life, damp wood hisses and spits. Smoke billows into your one-room hut, turning the interior into a medieval smokehouse. Your eyes water non-stop. Your throat feels raw as if you've been gargling gravel. And your hair and clothes absorb the stink until you're basically a walking fire pit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people sometimes hung bunches of herbs from the rafters, not only to cleanse the air, but to make the smoke smell a little less like wet goat. Sage, rosemary, even lavender if you were fancy. Think of it as 14th century incense. Plus a side of coughing, your hearth sits in the center of your hut, surrounded by rough stones. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof for the smoke to find its way out. That's the theory anyway. In practice, smoke often refuses to cooperate, swirling low across the room until everyone's crouched near the floor like terrified frogs. Historians still argue whether smoke inhalation contributed to the low life expectancy among medieval peasants. Some say yes, it's like living in a permanent barbecue. Others say it was no worse than the daily grime peasants faced everywhere. Either way, your lungs aren't winning any prizes. Joke break. Medieval Homeowner's Guide to Heating. Smoke rises, eventually. And it's not just the smoke. Firewood is a finite resource. If you live near a lord's forest, good luck sneaking branches without getting fined, or worse, accused of stealing royal property. Medieval law was strict about forest rights, and peasants could end up paying crippling fees or getting tossed in stocks just for collecting fallen sticks. One quirky little custom. Some villages held firewood rights, letting peasants gather dead wood during certain days, but not others. So there's this comedic spectacle of villagers sprinting into the woods on designated days, hacking branches like a medieval Black Friday sale. Why midwinter, your woodpile has shrunk alarmingly. Every stick you toss into the flames feels like burning coins. You start cutting smaller pieces. Then you start burning straw. Eventually, you're huddling in your cloak, trying to convince yourself that body heat alone will suffice. Of course, there's the other fuel source. Dung. That's right, many peasants dried animal droppings into fuel bricks. Practical? Absolutely. Glamorous? Not remotely. If you've ever wondered what burning poop smells like, the answer is, it's exactly as memorable as you'd imagine. Yet you might have no choice. If winter stretches long and your firewood runs out, you burn what you've got. Sticks, straw, dung, even old thatch pulled from your own roof. The irony. The more thatch you strip, the colder your hut becomes. Congratulations. You've entered the medieval downward spiral of home improvement. Another mainstream reality. Medieval fires provided more than heat. They were essential for cooking, boiling water to make it safe or safer, to drink, and creating light after sundown. So when your fire fails, it's not just your toes at risk. It's your entire way of surviving. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some places, peasants believed fire could protect them from supernatural evil. A sputtering hearth was seen as a bad omen, signaling that witches or demons might be lurking nearby. So imagine your fire dies out in the middle of the night, and suddenly every creak and groan in your hut sounds like something clawing its way inside. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely believed such superstitions, or if people just used them as excuses for why life kept going wrong. One group insists folk truly thought demons sabotaged their hearths. Another suggests peasants were simply pragmatic. Blaming witches is faster than investigating damp wood. Joke break number 2. Why did the medieval fire go out? It saw your fuel bill. Every day, you play this exhausting game. Gather wood if you can, coax a smoky flame, and ration the warmth among your freezing family. And while you crouch there, eyes stinging, your neighbor might shuffle over, breathing his foul winter breath all over you because he's hoping to share your tiny fire. And let's be honest, that's the only warmth you're likely to get from him. Because outside, under the black trees and iron sky, something else prowls. Wolves, bandits, and worse. Step outside your smoky hut, and the world changes. The air hits your face like a slap. Stars glitter cold and indifferent above black trees. Snow crunches underfoot, echoing across empty fields. You try to convince yourself you're just taking a quick walk, but the truth is, every step away from your door feels like you're crossing into enemy territory. Because medieval peasants didn't merely fear the cold, they feared what moved in it. Let's start with the obvious. Wolves die in winter. Wolves come closer to villages, driven by hunger. You hear their howls spiraling up through the night, distant but clear, like spectral choirs rehearsing for a particularly grim concert. The sound prickles every hair on your neck. The village dogs bristle, tails tucked. You grip your walking stick tighter, even though you know a stick's not much good against a pack of starving predators. Mainstream historical fact: wolves were a very real threat in medieval Europe, especially during harsh winters. Accounts from France and Eastern Europe describe wolves entering villages, attacking livestock, and sometimes people. There were even official bounties on wolf pelts in certain regions because local authorities knew hungry wolves meant a lot of missing sheep, and occasionally a missing shepherd. One quirky tidbit: medieval folks sometimes believed that wolves were drawn to human breath, so people would tie scarves over their mouths to hide their exhalations. Imagine trudging through snow, barely able to breathe, while hoping a strip of cloth keeps you from becoming wolf dinner. But wolves weren't the only terror lurking in winter's shadows. Bandits prowled the roads, emboldened by empty highways and the knowledge that no one wanted to travel far in deadly cold. Historians still argue whether crime truly increased in winter or whether medieval chroniclers simply dramatized the dangers to keep people obedient. Some say bandits roamed more freely because fewer patrols were out. Others claim bandits preferred warmer months when they could actually run without freezing bits of themselves off. Still, the fear was real. Picture you, clutching a sack of flour you've bartered from the next village. The forest path seems deserted, until shapes detach from the trees. Cloaked figures demand your flour, your cloak, and maybe your boots. And out here, nobody's coming to save you. Joke break, the medieval robber's motto: your money or your turnips. Even supernatural fears grow teeth in winter. The long nights breed legends. Shapeshifters, night demons, witches who ride on gusts of snow to steal warmth from children's breath. It sounds silly in daylight, but stand alone under a moonlit sky, and every rustling branch becomes a claw. One fringe tidbit: in parts of Central Europe, people believed in werewolves who prowled specifically during Yule, hunting livestock or dragging lone travelers into the woods. They said the wolf men could be recognized by a long, brushy tail hidden under their tunic. So if your neighbor seems oddly lumpy around the waist, you might want to keep your distance. Your brain plays tricks. Every sound feels magnified. A snapping twig, a distant cry, the hush of wind shifting drifts of snow. Is that a fox or something worse? Travel becomes a gamble. Merchants who'd braved the roads all summer vanish for the season.
Village Gros Isolated.
News stops coming. Even the local priest might hesitate to ride out for mass if wolves are howling on the ridge. Historians still argue whether medieval isolation during winter was as severe as people describe in chronicles. Some scholars insist villages stayed connected through local paths and messenger systems. Others believe entire communities went weeks without visitors, trapped behind walls of snow. Either way, your world shrinks. The darkness grows longer, pressing in. Sunset comes at 4, sometimes earlier, leaving you hours of flickering candlelight, or nothing at all if your tallow supply runs out. And the mind drifts into old stories. Remember your neighbor who swore he saw glowing eyes in the woods last winter? Or the shepherd who claims he heard a woman weeping under the trees, but found only wolf tracks in the snow? In winter, rumors become gospel truth. And let's not forget one of the most medieval solutions to all this terror: bells. Villagers rang church bells to scare away both bandits and beasts. The theory was that holy sounds could drive evil back into the shadows. Of course, bells don't help much if the wolves are already chewing your leg. Joke break 2. Medieval security system. Ring bell. Pray. Repeat. Another quirky custom. Some villages posted night guards to walk the perimeter and keep watch. But in brutal cold, even the bravest guards sometimes curled up in a haystack instead, leaving the village open to surprise visitors with sharp teeth or sharp knives. Meanwhile, the forests loomed darker than ever, pines swaying like skeletal dancers. Snow falls so thick you can't see your own hands. And you realize that for medieval peasants, winter wasn't just a season. It was a living thing, a predator in its own right. And while you're out there worrying about wolves and bandits, you forget the next danger that sneaks closer the moment you huddle indoors. Sickness. Because if winter doesn't get you with its fangs, it'll try choking you out in a coughing fit instead. You slam your hut door shut against the wolves and bandits and blizzards. You stamp snow from your boots, rub your numb cheeks, and thank the saints you made it home in one piece. Except now you're trapped inside with another medieval winter horror. Sickness. Here's the cruel truth. When winter locks everyone into small, smoky rooms, disease becomes the invisible predator slinking around your ankles. You're packed tighter than sardines in a barrel, breathing each other's stale air and sharing space with livestock who, quite frankly, are not known for their personal hygiene. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval homes often sheltered animals during winter. Goats, sheep, pigs, even chickens sometimes roost indoors to avoid freezing. Practical? Absolutely. Cozy? Sure, if you enjoy sleeping beside a goat with chronic flatulence, so there you are, crouched near your smoky fire, listening to the symphony of human coughs, chicken clucks, and the occasional goat sneeze. Every sneeze is suspect. Every cough might spell doom. One fringe tidbit. Medieval people believed that certain smells carried disease. So if your hut stank, which it did, folks thought bad air might cause pestilence. This gave rise to delightful home remedies like burning herbs, boiling vinegar, or stuffing sweet-smelling flowers into little pouches to hang around your neck. Basically, medieval aromatherapy, but less spa day, more please don't die. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood contagion or simply thought evil spirits floated in through the smoke hole. Some insist medieval folk noticed patterns of transmission, like whole families falling sick. Others say they blame demons, curses, or planetary misalignments. Joke break, medieval health tip. If you can't see the stars because your hut is full of smoke, at least you'll be safe from star-borne diseases. Illnesses crowd the winter months. Fevers, chills, hacking coughs that sound like a pair of blacksmiths hammering inside your chest. In winter, a common cold might tip into deadly pneumonia. Even simple infections became mortal threats because your body's run down from weeks of hunger and cold. Let's not forget the charming practice of medieval diagnosis. Your family gathers round as you gasp and wheeze. In comes the local doctor, whose qualifications might be a few Latin phrases and the ability to read a star chart. He inspects your urine carefully, squinting at it like it's fine wine. Medieval folks believed urine color, smell, and even taste, revealed the balance of your humors. One mainstream reality. Medical practice relied on the theory of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much cold and wet? Your phlegm was out of whack. The prescription: hot drinks, warm blankets, and possibly leeches. Joke break number 2. Medieval wellness influencer. This year, I'm balancing my humors. Next year, I'm balancing my finances. It's not just your body suffering. The noise alone is enough to drive you mad. Coughs echo off the timber walls. Children wail. Adults groan. You're trying to sleep while someone hacks up a lung in the corner. The air grows thick with heat, sweat, and the ever-present haze of wood smoke. Remember, there's no privacy. One-room huts mean everyone's sickness is everyone's problem. A neighbor might pop in for a visit and bring the plague as an uninvited +1. Historians still argue whether medieval communities helped the sick out of neighborly compassion or kept their distance in pure self-preservation. Some records suggest villages banded together. Others reveal entire streets abandoned during outbreaks, doors nailed shut to trap the disease, and the infected inside. And we can't leave out medieval cures. If you're coughing blood, someone might slice open a vein for bloodletting, or perhaps whip up a medicinal brew of wormwood, sage, and honey. Sometimes, cure meant pressing a live pigeon to your chest. Poor pigeon. One fringe tidbit. Medieval folks sometimes used dried toad powder as a medicine for plague swellings. Yes, you dry a toad, grind it to dust, and sprinkle it on your sores. Bon appetit. Of course, even if you avoid disease, mental strain sets in. Trapped indoors, you start resenting your family's every breath. The crowded hut feels smaller each day. Fights break out over silly things: who hogs the blanket, who finished the last turnip, whose snoring sounds like a drowning boar. But you can't risk staying outside too long either, because the cold can kill you faster than any cough. It's a medieval gamble: freeze to death outside or choke on other people's germs indoors. Joke break number 3, medieval wellness routine. Breathe deeply and regret it. You're caught in this relentless cycle. Cold forces you inside. Close quarters breed disease. Illness weakens your body. And as the weeks drag on, you realize your fate this winter depends not only on your cellar stock, or your tools, or the wolves outside, but also on the invisible enemies lurking in every cough and fevered breath. And just when you think it can't get worse, you remember that winter hardship begins months earlier, in the autumn fields, where a single bad harvest could doom the entire village to misery. So, you're huddled by the fire, coughing, wheezing, and glaring at your family for breathing your air. But let's rewind a bit, because winter's claws don't start scratching at your door in December. They dig in months earlier, during the harvest. For a medieval peasant, autumn is make or break. It's the season that decides whether you'll coast through winter with enough food, or spend February gnawing on tree bark. Here's the brutal reality: one bad harvest can doom an entire village. And the thing about medieval agriculture is, there's a million ways for it to go spectacularly wrong. Mainstream historical fact: medieval peasants relied heavily on a 3-field system. Fields were rotated so one grew grain, another legumes, and the third rested fallow. It helped preserve soil nutrients, in theory. But even good planning couldn't save you from freak weather. A single summer hailstorm could flatten entire acres. A sudden September frost might kill off your grain before it ripened. Historians still argue whether medieval Europe's population booms stressed agricultural resources beyond their limits. Some believe peasants pushed fields too hard, draining the soil and leaving themselves vulnerable to famine. Others say plenty of land remained underused, and bad harvests were mostly about bad luck with the weather gods. Either way, peasants lived in a state of low-key panic all harvest season. You'd watch the sky like a hawk, praying for sun but not too much sun, rain but not torrential rain. You wanted Goldilocks weather just right, but nature rarely obliged. One quirky tidbit: medieval people believed certain saints controlled specific weather. Saint Swithin was famously tied to rain in England. If it rained on his feast day, folks believed it'd rain for 40 more days. So naturally, peasants spent St. Swithin's Day staring at clouds with the same intensity modern people reserve for checking hurricane forecasts. Here's how a bad harvest sets you up for winter disaster. Fewer grains mean less flour. No bread, no ale. Poor legume yields equals no protein. Sparse hay harvest equals starving livestock come January. Low fruit or nut harvest equals no winter treats and less trade revenue. Remember, most peasants couldn't simply go shopping for more grain. Markets might be distant. Roads might be impassable. Prices skyrocketed during shortages, making a single sack of grain cost as much as a good cow. Joke break: medieval life hack. Can't afford grain? Try eating your tax bill. It's equally dry and tasteless. If your harvest failed, your entire village felt the impact. Tithes still had to be paid to the church. Taxes still went to the Lord or the king. They didn't lower your dues because your wheat died. No medieval monarch ever said, "Hey, don't worry about it, bud. Keep your silver." Instead, you'd find yourself scraping the bottom of the grain bin by December. And rationing isn't just physical, it's psychological torture. Every meal becomes a negotiation. Do you finish the last carrots tonight or save them for next week's stew? One fringe tidbit. Peasants sometimes stretched flour by mixing it with ground peas, beans, or even sawdust. Yes, actual sawdust, called famine bread. It filled your belly, but probably shaved years off your teeth's lifespan. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were better off living in manor-controlled villages, where lords might help in lean times, or as free peasants who had more independence but fewer safety nets. There's evidence of both outcomes. Some lords handed out emergency grain. Others raised rents to squeeze every penny from starving tenants. Imagine standing in the fields in late September, checking your wheat stalks. Are they golden and fat, or shriveled and gray? That sight alone could determine whether your family survives the next 6 months. If things went well, your harvest festival would be a riot of drinking, dancing, and enough roasted meat to make your arteries weep. If things went poorly, the festival might still happen, but the feast could be watery vegetable soup, plus one scrawny chicken meant to feed 20. Joke break 2. Medieval harvest toast. May next year's crop be less disappointing than my eldest son. A failed harvest also triggered fear of deeper consequences. Crop failures weren't just oops, we'll try again next year. They bred famine, which bred disease, which bred social collapse. Starving people might flee villages, leaving fields untended. Entire families might disappear, seeking charity in distant towns. And while all this looms over you, your fields lie there under snow, mocking your helplessness. By December, every bite you take is haunted by memories of the harvest. If your barn's empty, you can't pretend spring will come soon enough. Your animals will die one by one. Your neighbors will become rivals for scraps. Point 1 quirky custom. Some peasants performed rituals to charm the fields for next year's harvest. They'd bury bread in furrows, sprinkle holy water over the soil, or parade images of saints around the boundary lines. Anything to hedge their bets against a cruel winter. Historians still argue whether such rituals were purely religious or thinly veiled acts of folk magic. Maybe both. When your entire survival depends on a few inches of grain, you'll try anything, even talking to lumps of dirt. And so you hunker down, remembering every sheaf of wheat that never filled your barn. The weight of winter presses on your chest, because a bad harvest means this winter could be the one that finally takes you. But even if your fields gave plenty, there's another hazard waiting in every bucket of water you try to drink. Let's say, by some miracle, your harvest was decent. Your barns hold grain. Your root cellar isn't empty. You've even managed to avoid wolves, bandits, and plaguey neighbors. Fantastic. Except now you've got to drink something. And in a medieval winter, safe drinking water is far from guaranteed. Picture this. Your breath puffs into silver clouds as you trudge out to the well. The rope is stiff as iron, the bucket rimmed in ice. You chip away crust after crust, each blow sending splinters of frozen water into your face. Finally, you lower the bucket into the black, echoing depths, and haul it up, sloshing with what you hope is drinkable water. Except there's a problem. You can't see what's lurking inside. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval wells were prone to contamination. Human waste, animal droppings, runoff from manure heaps. Basically, the entire contents of a village's filth found its way into the water table sooner or later. Winter didn't magically purify anything. It just put a layer of ice over the problem. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood waterborne disease in a scientific sense. Some claim peasants noticed patterns, that certain wells made people sick, but couldn't pinpoint why. Others argue the danger remained largely invisible until germ theory centuries later. Point 1 quirky tidbit. Medieval people sometimes believed spirits lived in wells. It wasn't just about drinking water, it was about appeasing unseen beings. In some places, folks dropped coins or bread into wells as offerings, hoping to keep the water sweet. Imagine tossing your last crust of bread into a hole because you think a sprite lives down there. So, let's say you're well suspect. You might try melting snow instead. Nice idea in theory, until you realize snow can carry soot from your roof, bird droppings, and heaven knows what else. And it takes a mountain of snow to produce even 1 bucket of liquid. Joke break. Medieval water diet plan. Lose weight fast when half your water freezes solid and the other half tries to kill you. If you're fancy or desperate, you might turn to ale. And not for fun. Ale was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling. Even weak ale killed off some germs. Peasants drank it daily, including children. So if you picture medieval kids staggering around sloshed, not quite, but they were definitely sipping mild booze with breakfast. Mainstream reality, small ale, the low alcohol brew peasants drank, was often safer than water. It had just enough alcohol to discourage bacteria. It wasn't strong enough to get you roaring drunk, unless you drank it by the bucket, which, let's be honest, you probably did on feast days. But ale's no perfect solution. Brewing takes grain, fuel, and precious time. In a harsh winter, you might not have spare barley to spare. So you ration your ale, sip water cautiously, and pray you don't wake up with gut-wrenching cramps. Point one fringe tidbit. In some places, peasants believed certain wells froze because witches cast spells on them. So rather than blame manure runoff, they blamed old Gertrude 3 huts over for giving their well a magical evil eye. Historians still argue whether these accusations arose from real fear or convenient scapegoating. Some say villagers genuinely believed witches fouled water. Others think it was a convenient excuse to vent frustration or settle old feuds. If you did fall sick from bad water, you'd endure days of violent stomach misery. Medieval folks described it colorfully: flux, bloody flux, or simply the looseness. You'd dehydrate fast. And remember, no for fluids existed, and the medieval cure? A brew of wine and herbs, or a poultice slapped on your belly, or prayers, lots of prayers. Joke break 2, medieval doctor's prescription. Drink less water. Problem solved. Imagine the tension every time you scoop water from your bucket. Will it quench your thirst, or send you sprinting for the latrine, clutching your belly? And if the well freezes solid, you're stuck melting snow. Or, in desperate times, skimming slush off a muddy ditch. Point one quirky medieval habit. People sometimes flavored water with herbs or spices, not just for taste, but because they believed it cleansed the liquid. Think of it as proto-infused water. Only, instead of cucumber slices, you'd toss in rosemary or sage. Historians still argue whether this practice genuinely reduced bacterial contamination or was purely superstition. Some modern tests show certain herbs have mild antimicrobial properties. Others say it wouldn't have made much difference in a bucket full of medieval microbes. So here you are, surviving on smoky air, half rations of pottage, and cautious sips of whatever liquid hasn't turned into poison. And while your stomach's churning, you start worrying about your clothes. Because winter's cold doesn't just bite your skin. It tries to freeze your entire wardrobe into stiff medieval origami. So your harvest might be decent, your water hopefully drinkable, and your ale rationed like liquid gold. But there's another piece of the winter survival puzzle: clothing. Because in medieval winter, it's not just the cold that tries to kill you. It's the sheer indignity of your outfit turning into medieval cardboard. Picture yourself getting dressed before dawn. It's dark, breath smoking in the chill air, and your clothes, oh dear, are practically frozen to the wall. You try to tug your tunic off its peg, only to discover it's stiff as a wooden plank. Mainstream historical fact: medieval clothing for peasants was mostly made of wool. Wool was a wonder material, warm even when damp, but it came with drawbacks. It soaked up water like a sponge, took ages to dry, and could freeze into stiff sheets if left in icy air overnight. Historians still argue whether medieval people layered extensively or simply endured the cold with minimal garments. Some chronicles describe peasants bundled in multiple tunics and cloaks. Others suggest poorer folks owned little more than a single woolen outfit, patched and repatched until it practically walked off on its own. Point one quirky tidbit. Peasants sometimes hung their clothes above the hearth overnight. The heat softened stiff garments, but also filled them with smoke. So you'd start the day reeking like a walking bonfire. Medieval laundry day. Ode to campfire. Joke break. Medieval fashion tip. Wrinkles fall right out. When your shirt freezes flat, undergarments were linen, if you were lucky enough to afford them. But linen was expensive. Poorer peasants often went without, wearing only wool next to their skin. Scratchy? Very. Warm? Mostly. Chic? Not so much. Even the wealthier peasants had limits. Dyeing cloth was costly. Bright colors meant higher social rank, or extra silver spent at the dyer's workshop. Many villagers wore earth tones: brown, gray, muddy green, which, let's be honest, is very practical if you're going to fall in a ditch or wrestle sheep all day. Point one fringe tidbit. In some regions, villagers believed red cloth protected against evil spirits in winter. So even the humblest peasant might stitch a tiny strip of red fabric into their tunic for protection. A medieval lucky charm. But here's the catch. Layering only works if you own enough layers. Many peasants possessed one set of winter clothes and one for summer. If your winter tunic tore, froze stiff, or got soaked, you were in trouble. Sewing new garments required precious wool, time, and decent light to see your stitches. Scarce resources in midwinter. Let's talk footwear. Medieval shoes for peasants were often leather turn shoes. Simple pieces stitched together, sometimes with wooden soles nailed underneath. In summer, fine. In winter, they soaked up water like biscuits dipped in stew. Your toes froze, your soles were thin, and snow snuck in through every seam. Historians still argue whether peasants ever used wooden clogs or pattens, platform overshoes, to stay above the mud and slush. Some evidence suggests they did, especially in wetter regions. Others think peasants went barefoot or wore cheap leather until it disintegrated. Either way, your odds of warm toes were slim. Joke break 2. Medieval shoe advertisement. Now with 5% more waterproofing than a sponge. Socks existed, sure, but mostly for wealthier folk. Some peasants wrapped strips of wool or linen around their feet instead, tying them in place with string. Functional, if not exactly the height of fashion. Imagine unwrapping your foot bandages at night to find them frozen into a crusty foot sculpture. And gloves? Ha! Luxury items. Most peasants used mittens if they could get them. Otherwise, they worked barehanded, cramming fingers into armpits between chores for a little warmth. Nothing says cozy winter morning like huddling in a snow-covered field. Fingers stiff and blue. Point one quirky medieval hack. Peasants sometimes stuffed straw or moss inside their shoes for insulation. It helped keep the cold from biting too fiercely, and probably gave your footwear a delightful earthy scent. Historians still argue whether such improvised insulation was widespread or rare. Some accounts suggest it was common practice among poorer peasants. Others insist it's an over-romanticized notion, invented later by nostalgic chroniclers. And don't even get started on laundry. Washing clothes in winter meant hacking a hole through the ice in the village pond, scrubbing woolen tunics in freezing water, then trying to dry them in bitter winds. Result? Your shirt transformed into a medieval ice sculpture. So sometimes you just didn't wash your clothes. Medieval folks accepted a certain level of dirt and odor as the price of survival. You'd shake off mud, pick out straw, and call it good enough. Joke break 3, medieval perfume slogan. Now with fewer goat hairs. Even when you did manage a wash, there was the problem of lice and fleas. Winter didn't kill them off entirely. They hunkered down in seams and folds of cloth, waiting for the warmth of your skin. You'd scratch yourself raw and mutter curses, but short of boiling your clothes and risking them shrinking into doll-sized tunics, there was no permanent solution. Point one fringe tidbit. Some medieval people wore charms or amulets to ward off lice. Herbs sewn into tiny cloth bags, pinned under collars, were supposed to repel the little beasts. Whether they worked, let's just say the lice probably weren't too bothered. Historians still argue whether lice infestations were simply accepted as inevitable or treated as signs of poverty and neglect. Many suggest that everyone, even kings, dealt with lice. Others think social rank offered a tiny edge, thanks to better hygiene and more frequent laundry, so there you stand in winter. Layered like a woolen onion, feet stuffed with moss, hair smoky from the hearth, and your clothes frozen into rigid slabs. And that's before you even try to venture outside. Because out there waits another problem, the dwindling daylight that shrinks your entire world. So, you're wrapped in stiff wool, smelling like goat-smoked fireplace, feet bundled in straw, and your clothes barely bending at the elbows. But there's something else pressing on your mind. The light is running out. Winter steals the sun. And in medieval times, darkness wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous, lonely, and downright disorienting. Mainstream historical fact: medieval Europe saw daylight shrink to as little as 8 hours during deep winter, depending on latitude. In places like England or Germany, midwinter days could be short, gray, and utterly joyless. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, it felt like someone had slammed the door on your entire world. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly organized their days around sunrise and sunset or simply pushed on through the dark with candles and rushlights. Some chronicles suggest peasants staggered their labor into night shifts, especially during harvest or emergencies. Others insist nighttime was strictly for resting and locking the door. Imagine it. You finish your chores. You peer outside. The sun's already gone, though it's barely past 4 in the afternoon. The sky is bruised purple, fields vanish under drifting snow, and your breath hangs thick and white in the gloom. You might step out briefly, but every rustle makes your heart race. One quirky tidbit. Medieval folks sometimes thought night air itself was unhealthy, especially in winter. They called it miasma, believing sickness drifted on cold, damp winds. So if you wandered out after dark, neighbors might scold you for inviting fevers. Joke break. Medieval bedtime story. Once upon a time, oh wait, it's dark. Everyone go to sleep. Let's talk about light sources. You didn't flick a switch. You relied on candles, rushlights, or oil lamps. Candles were expensive, often reserved for churches, the wealthy, or special feast days. Rushlights were the peasant solution. Dry reeds or rushes dipped in animal fat, lit to burn with a feeble glow. They smoked. They dripped grease. They flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced on your timber walls like ghostly fingers. One fringe tidbit. Some medieval folks believed flickering flames foretold supernatural events, like a death in the village. So if your rushlight sputtered and flared, you'd clutch your tunic and whisper prayers.
Sleepticht Rushlights burned fast.
An hour, maybe 2 if you were lucky, so you rationed them like gold. Families sat together in near darkness, speaking in low voices. Your day shrank into a tiny pool of light. The rest of the world became an abyss beyond the hut door. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants felt genuine terror at the darkness, or simply accepted it as part of life. Some suggest people cultivated a different relationship with night, finding comfort in communal firesides and storytelling. Others emphasize how darkness symbolized danger and evil in countless medieval texts. Joke break number 2, medieval lighting tips. 1 rushlight for light, 2 rushlights if you're feeling fancy, 3 rushlights, and congratulations, you're basically the king. Darkness wasn't just psychological. It changed how you worked. Tasks requiring sharp eyes, sewing, weaving, sharpening tools had to happen during daylight. Once night fell, your choices were limited. You might mend a fishing net by firelight, but your eyes burned and watered from the smoke. If you were a traveling merchant, darkness spelled the end of business. No street lamps.
No lanterlit jaiguas.
Roads were dangerous, full of thieves and beasts. You'd either stay put or risk everything. 1 quirky medieval custom. People held communal night gatherings during winter called spinning bees. Villagers would gather in one hut, pooling rushlights to work and gossip together. It was both practical and social, a medieval co-working space minus the Wi-Fi. Yet even these gatherings had shadows. Rumors claimed spinning bees sometimes turned rowdy, with singing, dancing, and, heaven forbid, a little forbidden romance. Church authorities occasionally cracked down on them for breeding moral corruption. Apparently, medieval folks couldn't even spin yarn without someone worrying about sinful behavior. Historians still argue whether such moral panic was justified or merely the church's attempt to police any social fun. Some suggest spinning bees were tame affairs. Others hint they were the perfect cover for secret trysts. But for the most part, peasants feared the dark. You couldn't see wolves lurking beyond the hedgerows, or bandits hiding near crossroads. Even the creak of timber in your hut might convince you some ghostly figure was pacing the rafters. And don't forget, the church reinforced these fears. Night was tied to sin, demons, witches, and unseen evils. Every squeak in the dark became potential evidence that Satan himself was circling your thatched roof. Joke break number 3, medieval security system, heavenly light. Unfortunately, only available during daytime hours, and the mental toll was real. Short days meant boredom, depression, and the creeping suspicion that winter might never end. People measured time by candles burning down inch by inch, by snow piling higher outside the door, by frost creeping across the thatch. Your world grew smaller with each passing sunset. You longed for spring, but winter always seemed endless. And even when dawn returned, it arrived pale and grudging, like someone flicking on the dimmest night light imaginable, so you keep sitting close to the rushlight, shivering, wrapped in your smoky tunic, praying the flame lasts one more hour, because out there in the dark, wolves, spirits, and the weight of silence so heavy it makes your bones ache. And while you huddle in that tiny glow, you realize that fear of winter wasn't just physical. It wormed its way into every part of medieval life, including how people tried to protect themselves with charms, rituals, and the powerful shield of faith. So, there you sit in your smoky hut, wrapped in your one-wool tunic, clutching your rushlight as shadows crawl across the walls. Outside, winter howls. Inside, fear gnaws. And here's where medieval folks turn to their last, and sometimes only, line of defense. Faith, magic, and every charm they could get their frostbitten fingers on. Because winter, to a medieval peasant, wasn't just cold. It was alive, prowled like a beast. And if you wanted to survive, you'd better find ways to fight back. Spiritually, if not physically. Mainstream historical fact: the medieval church played a central role in daily life. From prayers for good harvests to exorcisms for suspected demons, faith was woven into everything, especially during harsh winters when physical survival seemed beyond human control. Historians still argue whether medieval people viewed faith primarily as deep religious devotion or as a pragmatic toolkit for handling everyday disasters. Some say villagers were profoundly spiritual. Others suggest religion functioned as insurance against forces they couldn't explain. Point one quirky tidbit: medieval peasants sometimes sprinkled holy water on their doorways to keep out winter spirits and witches. If the priest blessed your home, that invisible line of protection felt as solid as a fortress wall. Joke break: medieval pest control, holy water, 100% effective against demons. Slightly less so against mice. Let's start with charms. Medieval peasants adored them. Tiny crosses, dried herbs tied in bundles, animal teeth strung on leather cords. Each charm promised protection. From frost that might kill your barley shoots, from wolves prowling the village paths, from sudden fevers that struck in the night, from devils whispering in the dark corners of your hut. Point one fringe tidbit: in some regions, peasants carried thunderstones, mysterious flint tools they believed were fallen stars or petrified lightning. They thought these stones protected them from storms and evil spirits, especially during the long, stormy nights of winter. Of course, charms and relics weren't the only tools. Rituals helped soothe terror when the snow piled high and the wind shrieked like banshees. Entire villages would process around their fields carrying candles, singing litanies to chase away winter's curse. In France and parts of Germany, people performed blessing of the plow ceremonies in January, hoping to ensure spring would return with fertile soil. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely religious or deeply intertwined with pre-Christian pagan traditions. Many scholars believe medieval Christianity simply absorbed older rites, giving them a Christian gloss while villagers still secretly thought of them as magic insurance. One quirky medieval practice. Some peasants baked special loaves called blessing bread, marked with crosses. They'd break pieces off and scatter them in their fields or drop crumbs into wells to keep evil spirits from spoiling next year's crops or the water supply. Joke break number 2. Medieval baking slogan: our bread repels demons and occasionally feeds people too. Faith extended into daily habits. People whispered prayers while dressing. They crossed themselves before stepping outside. They invoked saints for everything from safe childbirth to protection against frostbite. Take Saint Blaise, for instance, a patron saint against throat ailments. If your winter cough turned nasty, you might pray to him. Or Saint Barbara, protector against sudden death, important when icicles hung over your door like medieval spears ready to drop. Mainstream reality. Nearly every medieval occupation and disaster had a corresponding saint. Sailors had Street Nicholas. Shepherds turned to Saint Wendelin. Farmers prayed to Saint Isidore. Even butter churners had a patron saint. Medieval life was like a spiritual phone book. You always knew who to call. But the church wasn't the only answer. Folk magic flourished in winter. People muttered charms over steaming pots. Women whispered spells into bread dough. Men etched protective symbols onto doors and barn beams. Was it Christian? Pagan? Nobody cared as long as it worked. One fringe tidbit. Some medieval villagers believed spitting into the fire could ward off evil spirits during winter storms. The hiss of the spit meeting flame was thought to mimic demons screaming as they fled. Charming mental image, isn't it? Historians still argue whether church authorities turned a blind eye to folk practices or cracked down on them harshly. Some priests quietly tolerated charms and rituals, figuring it was better than losing their flock to fear. Others thundered from the pulpit, warning that any magic was the devil's work, and the lines blurred constantly. A blessed candle from the church might ward off evil, but so might a carved wooden amulet from your grandmother's jewelry box. In the freezing dark of February, peasants cared less about theology and more about survival. Joke break number 3, medieval motto: when in doubt, pray and carry garlic. Superstition even shaped how people approached daily chores. Some refused to spin wool on certain days, fearing it would tangle the fates for the coming year. Others never swept the house after dark. It was believed you might accidentally sweep out your household luck. One quirky medieval habit. People sometimes salted the thresholds of their homes. They believed salt repelled demons, witches, and even evil winter weather. Plus, it helped keep you from slipping on icy steps. 2-for-1 medieval life hack. Historians still argue whether these practices genuinely comforted peasants or simply added one more layer of stress. Imagine trying to remember dozens of rules just to keep winter's evils at bay. No spinning on Friday. No sweeping at night. Always carry salt. And don't forget to spit in the fire. Yet for all the fear, faith gave people hope. When the wind screamed and snow buried the roads, belief was sometimes the only thing standing between despair and the next sunrise. Even skeptics joined in rituals because community itself was protection. And as winter stretched on, these spiritual safeguards became lifelines. Because peasants knew that no matter how many prayers they said or charms they carried, winter could still deliver the ultimate blow. Hunger so deep it could drive a village to unspeakable acts. So you've prayed, sprinkled holy water, stuffed moss into your shoes, and rationed your rushlights down to pathetic stubs. But winter, relentless beast that it is, doesn't just gnaw at your fingers and toes. It comes for your belly and your sanity. Because the cruelest fear lurking in a medieval winter is hunger. Not the skip lunch, I'm cranky kind of hunger. We're talking true marrow-deep famine. Mainstream historical fact: Europe suffered countless famines during the Middle Ages, often triggered by bad harvests, early frosts, floods, or war. The Great Famine of 1315 to 17 killed millions. Entire regions saw crops fail, livestock die, and communities collapse under the weight of starvation. Historians still argue whether these famines were purely natural disasters or made worse by feudal demands and royal taxation. Some scholars insist peasant survival was sabotaged by rulers who refused to lower taxes even when fields lay barren. Others say climate swings alone could doom the best-prepared village. One quirky tidbit. Some medieval people believed famine was divine punishment for sin. Chronicles describe villagers parading relics through muddy streets, hoping to appease God and coax food from the sky. Imagine dragging a saint's shinbone through snowdrifts while your stomach growls like a bear. But let's talk about what famine looked like on the ground. First, your meals shrink, stews thin out, bread loaves get smaller, vegetables vanish. Every crumb is counted, guarded like treasure. People start eating foods they'd usually consider animal fodder. Acorn flour bread, bitter and harsh on the gut. Grass boiled into soups that taste like sadness. Bark stripped from trees, ground into paste. One fringe tidbit. During some medieval famines, chroniclers recorded people grinding bones into flour. It added bulk to bread but, needless to say, offered zero nutrition and an unsettling crunch. Historians still argue whether such extreme reports were exaggerated moral tales or grim reality. Some scholars think chroniclers sensationalized cannibalism and bone flour as cautionary stories. Others believe desperate villagers did indeed resort to horrifying measures when the cupboard was truly bare. Joke break, medieval cookbook. Tonight's recipe, tree bark. Tomorrow's recipe, slightly different tree bark. When food vanished, prices skyrocketed. A single sack of wheat might cost triple its usual price. Lords and merchants sometimes hoarded grain, waiting to sell at the peak of desperation. Peasants who couldn't pay either starved or risked theft, poaching, or fleeing to distant towns. Imagine crouching in your hut in February, your entire family pale and hollow-eyed. The children's bellies swell with malnutrition, while their limbs look impossibly thin. Your joints ache from cold and weakness. You wake each day wondering which neighbor might die next. And winter only makes it worse. There's no wild fruit to forage, no fish from frozen streams, no green shoots to nibble. Everything's sealed under snow and ice. One quirky medieval belief. People thought eating certain animals during famine might bring bad luck or spiritual contamination. For example, consuming dogs or horses was taboo in many areas. Yet records show desperate peasants occasionally broke those taboos when the hunger grew unbearable. Historians still argue whether famine drove medieval communities to social breakdown or forged tighter solidarity. Some chronicles depict villages sharing food, pooling resources, and burying the dead with dignity. Others portray neighbors turning against each other, stealing grain, and whispering accusations of witchcraft. When you're starving, your mind changes. You become obsessed with food. Everything else, faith, propriety, even family ties, starts to blur under the weight of hunger. Parents might skip meals so children could eat. Entire villages might collapse because nobody had the strength to tend fields come spring. Joke break 2. Medieval fasting tip. Fasting for Lent is easy when you've got nothing left to eat anyway. And here's the darkest edge of medieval winter fear, the whispered possibility of cannibalism. Chroniclers recorded cases where desperate people resorted to eating human flesh during extreme famines. Whether these reports were widespread fact or lurid exaggeration is still debated, but the fear itself was very real. One fringe tidbit. In certain regions, cannibalism stories became cautionary tales used by the church to scare people into piety. Repent, or you'll end up like those villagers who ate each other. Comforting bedtime story, right? Historians still argue whether such acts were individual horrors or symptoms of total social collapse. Either way, the idea of neighbors turning on neighbors haunted medieval imagination. Even if you never witnessed it, the rumors alone could keep you awake on freezing nights. And let's not forget the ripple effects. Famine bred crime. Desperate peasants might steal grain from church stores, poach the Lord's deer, or raid distant villages. Punishments were harsh, sometimes even execution. Yet hunger drove people beyond fear of gallows or dungeons. Joke break 3, medieval motto. It's all fun and games until someone steals the last turnip. The psychological toll was crushing. You'd dream of food. You'd wake and weep because it wasn't real. You'd watch neighbors vanish, either fleeing in search of charity or perishing quietly in their huts. Even if you survived, memories of famine haunted you for the rest of your life. And though spring promised hope, it came with its own terror. The lean months between sowing and harvest, when supplies ran dangerously low. For medieval peasants, the calendar was a cycle of anxiety. Harvest or starve, survive or perish, so as the wind roars outside your hut and the snow drifts higher, you lie awake fearing the day your family might run out of food. Because in the medieval winter, hunger wasn't a distant possibility. It was a stalking wolf you could practically hear breathing just beyond the door. So, imagine you've endured months of darkness, your meager stores picked over, your belt notched tighter and tighter. The snow begins to melt. The days stretch a bit longer. You'd think this would be the moment medieval peasants finally breathe easy, right? Think again. Because now comes the hunger gap, the cruelest trick of all. Spring might mean sunshine, but it doesn't mean food. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval peasants dreaded the weeks between late winter and the next harvest. The hunger gap, or lean months, struck hardest between March and June. By then, winter stores were gone or spoiled, but the new crops hadn't ripened yet. It was a seasonal trap, hopeful skies above, empty bowls below. Historians still argue whether the hunger gap was deadlier than winter itself. Some records suggest mortality spiked higher in these lean months than during January blizzards. Others believe communities adapted well enough to stagger their stores and stretch supplies. One quirky tidbit. Medieval folks sometimes foraged young nettles and other early weeds as spring greens. It sounds healthy, modern chefs would call it foraged cuisine. But back then it was desperation salad, bitter and stringy, often mixed into stews for bulk rather than taste. Joke break, medieval spring menu, tonight's special. Dandelions, served 5 different ways, none of them good. Here's why the hunger gap hit so viciously. Your root cellar is empty or rotting, salted meats might have spoiled or been entirely eaten. Grain bins contain dusty handfuls of flour. Livestock are scrawny, half-starved from the winter. New lambs and calves are too small to butcher, so peasants found themselves in a cruel paradox. New life blossomed all around them. Buds on trees, green shoots in fields, yet their own bodies wasted away, unable to wait for harvest salvation. One fringe tidbit. Some medieval people believed eating the first green shoots of the year brought health and luck, so they'd ceremonially nibble fresh leaves, sometimes while reciting prayers. Even if it tasted like chewing a broom, it symbolized rebirth and hope. Historians still argue whether these rituals were rooted in ancient pagan customs or purely practical steps to ease vitamin deficiencies after months of salted meat and stale bread. And about that stale bread, by spring, what you had left was often hard enough to stun a burglar. Medieval folk softened old loaves by soaking them in broth or ale. But even then, the taste was, shall we say, uninspired. Joke break 2, medieval cooking tip. If your bread breaks the knife, it's probably time to invent cereal. The hunger gap wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Imagine knowing that warmer days bring no relief, only heightened craving. You'd stare at plowed fields, imagining them bursting with green grain, while your stomach screamed for food. During this time, communal bonds were tested. Neighbors might help each other, pooling the last scraps of dried peas or grain. But jealousy and suspicion brewed. If your family seemed better fed, whispers might spread. Did you hide grain? Did you steal from the tithe barn? Did you consort with witches for magical food? One quirky medieval practice. In some regions, people performed plow blessings in early spring. parading decorated plows through villages to ensure fertile fields. Villagers sometimes sang bawdy songs, mixing faith with earthy humor, anything to coax crops into growing faster. Historians still argue whether these spring rituals were hopeful community events or thinly veiled expressions of fear. Some chronicles paint them as joyous festivals. Others hint at desperation lurking under the songs and ribbons. Meanwhile, livestock struggled too. Cows and sheep were skeletal after the winter. Milk production dropped, butter churns stayed empty, and eggs were scarce because hens didn't lay well in cold months. Even the animals looked at you with hungry eyes. Joke break 3, medieval farmers lament. My cow's so thin, she's practically transparent. Peasants scoured forests and riverbanks for anything edible. Wild garlic sorrel leaves mushrooms. Careful, some were deadly, even frogs or snails, depending on local custom, but these wild pickings rarely replaced proper calories. It was survival food, enough to trick your stomach for another day. 1 fringe tidbit. In some places, peasants gathered birch sap as a sweet spring drink. It tasted watery but provided a little sugar and a hint of spring after months of salt and fat. Think medieval Gatorade, only with fewer electrolytes and more bark aftertaste. Historians still argue whether these foraging traditions were essential survival strategies or just minor supplements. Some scholars believe foraging played a crucial role in avoiding outright starvation. Others think it offered more psychological relief than real nutrition. And just when you thought the hunger gap couldn't get worse, disease arrived. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Spring rains bred filthy conditions. Fevers, dysentery, and respiratory infections surged. People who'd survived winter might finally succumb to illness as their bodies gave up the fight. So the hunger gap was the final trial in a medieval peasant's year. Winter threatened immediate cold and starvation. Spring mocked you with green fields and empty pantries. Even hope felt dangerous, because every day before harvest was a gamble with life itself. Yet peasants clung to scraps of optimism, because eventually the world did burst into color. Grain heads ripened, fruit trees blossomed, lambs fattened, and somewhere deep in your bones, you prayed that this year, finally, the harvest would be good enough to keep next winter's fear at bay. And then, finally, it happens. 1 morning, you step outside your creaking hut, and the air smells different, softer, sweet with damp soil instead of icy wind. Sunlight touches your face with a warmth you'd half forgotten existed. And in the fields, tiny green shoots push up through the mud like timid fingers reaching for the sky. Spring. You'd think this would mean relief at last. But for medieval peasants, spring was a time of hard labor, cautious hope, and lingering dread that winter's ghosts might still claw back for one last attack. Mainstream historical fact. Spring was the season for planting cereals like barley, oats, and rye. Every able-bodied person worked from dawn until dusk. Missing the proper sowing window could doom the entire year's harvest. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly welcomed spring or viewed it as another phase of relentless toil. Some records depict villagers dancing around maypoles and singing in fields. Others suggest the anxiety of sowing outweighed any celebration. 1 quirky tidbit. Some medieval peasants whispered secret planting spells as they scattered seed. Simple murmured words for good luck, hidden even from priests. Because no matter how pious you were, a bit of hedge-witch charm never hurt when your entire year's survival depended on those seeds. Joke break. Medieval weather forecast. Today, sunny with a 100% chance of back-breaking labor. You'd be out in those thawing fields, the mud sucking at your shoes, your back bent over a wooden plow. Oxen trudged ahead, ribs showing from their own winter hunger. Your breath steamed in cool air while crows cawed overhead, looking suspiciously hungry themselves. 1 fringe tidbit. In some places, peasants believed crows carried away the souls of people who died during winter, so their presence in the fields was both ominous and oddly comforting, a sign that spring had come and the spirits were moving on. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were genuine superstitions or poetic explanations layered onto practical realities, like why you'd want to chase birds away from precious seeds. Meanwhile, your body is a mess. Months of semi-starvation left you weakened. Knees ache, muscles feel like overcooked gruel, and your skin is pale and blotchy from lack of sunlight. Yet there's no resting, because now is the moment to gamble on survival. Spring also brings the fear of late frosts. One cold snap in April could kill tender shoots, setting the entire village back into hunger. You'd watch the sky each evening, praying it stayed mild. Joke break number 2. Medieval weather spell. Rain, rain, come today, but not too much or wash away my hay, and there's livestock to tend. After a brutal winter, animals need fresh pasture and careful nursing back to health. Sheep must be sheared. Calves born in icy barns during February now stumble into pastures, fragile and wobbly. Mainstream reality. Lambing season was crucial. Lambs meant meat, wool, and future flocks, but it was also a time of high mortality. One harsh cold snap could wipe out half a flock, devastating a peasant's livelihood. And don't forget taxes. Lords and churches came knocking as soon as spring arrived, demanding rents and tithes. Even if your stores were empty, you were expected to pay in grain, eggs, labor, or animals. One quirky medieval custom. Plow Monday marked the symbolic start of the farming year in some regions. Villagers paraded a plow through town, sometimes stopping at homes to collect coins. Refused to pay, and they'd heap manure at your door. Medieval peer pressure at its finest. Historians still argue whether Plow Monday was genuinely celebratory or a dreaded ritual of forced charity. Either way, it underscored how deeply spring sowing was tied to communal survival. Even joy was cautious. Festivities like May Day were full of life, dancing, flowers, singing. But behind the smiles was fear. What if the crops failed anyway? What if wolves prowled again next winter? Medieval people danced with one eye always on the future. One fringe tidbit. In parts of medieval Europe, people believed dancing around a maypole ensured fertility not just for people, but for crops and animals. A single skipped dance might mean a blighted harvest. So, even your revelry came with anxious strings attached. Historians still argue whether these rituals were lingering pagan rites or purely communal fun. Some church authorities tried to ban May Day customs as sinful. Others tolerated them as harmless folk tradition. Joke break number 3, medieval party rule. Dance like everyone's watching, because they are, and they'll accuse you of witchcraft if you don't. And while you're planting, you're haunted by memories of last winter. You remember the darkness, the fear, the gnawing hunger. You remember the tiny bag of rye dwindling grain by grain, the neighbor who vanished, the taste of snow melted in smoky pots. Yet, hope flickers stubbornly. The sun grows stronger. Birds sing in hedgerows. The earth smells alive again, rich and loamy. You dare to imagine bread that isn't half dust, ale that flows freely, clothes that don't freeze into planks overnight. Because as a medieval peasant, you know this brutal truth. You never truly escape winter. You just buy yourself another year. You plant in spring so you can fight off the cold when it circles back, relentless as ever. And in those precious moments between sowing seeds and fearing frost, you look up at the sun and whisper a silent prayer. Let this year be enough. So here you are, kneeling in thawed soil, sowing seeds with fingers still raw from the cold. You've survived another medieval winter just barely. Now you wait for those tiny green blades to rise into fields of gold. Because harvest, to a medieval peasant, was salvation itself. Mainstream historical fact: harvest season in medieval Europe usually arrived between late July and September, depending on the crop. It was an all-hands-on-deck affair. Lords, peasants, even clergy took part. Failing to bring in the harvest on time could mean famine when winter returned. Historians still argue whether medieval harvests truly brought joy or simply more exhaustion. Some accounts paint harvest as a time of music and community feasting. Others show peasants working until they collapsed, terrified that rain or hail could ruin the crop overnight. Point one quirky tidbit. Some villages performed rituals like the crying of the neck. At the harvest's end, the last sheaf of grain was held high, and everyone cheered or wept. It symbolized both relief and a silent fear. Would next year be this lucky? Joke break. Medieval harvest motto. Sleep is for the rich. Everyone else is threshing. Picture yourself in midsummer. You're swinging a sickle under a blazing sun. Sweat drips into your eyes. Midges swarm around your face. Grain dust sticks to your skin. Your arms ache and you've got blisters on blisters. But the sheaves keep piling up, and each one is hope against winter's return. Point one fringe tidbit. In some regions, it was bad luck to cut the first ear of grain without saying a prayer, or offering a pinch of the harvest to the spirits of the field. Even devout Christians hedged their bets when food was on the line. Historians still argue whether these harvest customs were ancient pagan relics or just peasants adding spiritual insurance to backbreaking labor. Either way, nobody wanted to offend the invisible powers who might help or hinder their crops. Once the grain was cut, it had to be threshed, winnowed, and stored. You'd swing flails to break kernels from husks, then toss grain in the air so the breeze carried away chaff. It was dusty, exhausting work. Coughing fits were common, and hay fever wasn't even a recognized medical term yet. You just sneezed and kept swinging. Joke break number 2. Medieval medical advice. Got a cough? Great. Just thrash some more grain. That'll help. Then came counting and tithing. The church demanded its share, usually a tenth. Lords claimed another chunk. Only after those dues did peasants know what remained for their own families. Sometimes it was plenty. Sometimes it was heartbreakingly little. Mainstream reality. Tithes could be paid in grain, honey, eggs, or labor. But in a bad year, giving away even a small portion meant genuine peril for the months ahead. Point one quirky custom. Some medieval peasants marked the end of harvest with a communal feast. They'd roast animals, brew strong ale, and dance until dawn. For a few precious hours, winter's specter faded, replaced by laughter and music. Historians still argue whether such harvest feasts were widespread or rare luxuries. Chroniclers differ wildly, depending on the region's wealth. Some villages celebrated lavishly, others barely at all. But even amid revelry, your mind couldn't entirely rest, because you'd begin calculating how much grain to save for seed, how much to keep for bread. Could you afford to brew ale this year? Would there be enough fodder for livestock come December? Joke break number 3, medieval accountant's joke. What's red, itchy, and keeps you awake all winter? Your tax ledger. Because every harvested kernel was a shield against the cold that would return. You remembered last winter's darkness, the moldy barley, the rushlights guttering low. You knew that wolves, sickness, and snow would come again. Point one fringe tidbit. Some villagers made tiny corn dollies from leftover stalks. They kept these figures until spring as good luck charms to ensure next year's fields grew as full and golden. A humble talisman against the cold. Historians still argue whether corn dollies were purely decorative or carried genuine magical power in peasant belief. Either way, they were part of the rhythm of life. A small symbol of hope in a cycle that never ended. So as autumn winds begin to blow, you store your harvest away. Barrels of grain, bundles of herbs, jars of honey. You patch your roof, mend your tools, and prepare your mind for the darkness ahead. Because you know one truth more than any chronicler ever wrote. The medieval peasant's fear of winter wasn't just the cold. It was the endless possibility of loss, of food, warmth, family, even your soul. Every seed you planted, every prayer you whispered, every charm you tucked under your tunic, all of it was part of a lifelong fight against the season that tried to wipe you from the earth. Yet somehow, you found joy in songs, in feasts, in green fields and roaring hearths. And though winter would always come, you carried forward, defiant and hopeful, daring to believe that next year might be kinder, because to be a medieval peasant was to live in the teeth of winter and still dream of spring. And so, here we are, my friend, at the end of our long medieval winter's journey. The fields lie quiet again, stubble shining under a silver moon. The last leaves flutter down like whispered secrets, and the air grows soft and still, carrying the faint scent of earth preparing for sleep. You, too, deserve rest. Close your eyes and imagine the distant ring of sickles, the soft shuffle of straw beneath your feet, the gentle crackle of a hearth you've tended through countless cold nights. Listen for the low murmur of wind brushing the thatch overhead. A lullaby older than kings, older than any book or chronicle. Your breath comes slow, rising in gentle clouds if you were standing outside, fading into the quiet as the stars begin their endless watch. In this moment, you're safe. The hunger is far away. The wolves are nothing but shadows in old tales. Remember that even in medieval winters, amidst snowdrifts and silent fears, there was laughter, jokes traded by firelight, songs echoing across fields, and always, always, the stubborn hope that spring would return. So sink deeper into your blankets. Let your muscles unwind, soft as new wool. Let your mind drift past the candle's glow, out into the cool night where the stars will overhead, eternal guardians of your gentle sleep. You've survived the cold. You've endured the darkness. And now you can rest warm and safe, knowing that even the harshest winter cannot last forever. Good night, my brave time traveler. Dream of green fields, gentle breezes, and a sun that always rises.